We've seen the international fight against drugs is a daunting one, so how should governments attack the problem? I spoke to Sanho Tree. He's director of the Drug Policy Project, which promotes alternatives to current domestic and international drug strategies.
We're talking about usually private adult consensual behavior that takes place in private, right? And so it's very difficult for law enforcement to disrupt these activities. That's the nature of the black market and the drug problem. You can't declare a war on this problem, right? Because it's very dangerous to declare a war against an enemy that is quite literally incapable of surrendering. Because we're talking about individual actors for the most part. So those who are consuming it in the drugs, in the clubs, those who are smuggling, with the exception of the kingpins, most people, are doing this because they're individual actors, and they think they'll get away with it, and by and large, most people do. And so you will never get a coherent, organized surrender. There's no high command of the drug world that says, okay, everyone give up, we finally had enough. You money launderers stop laundering, producers stop producing, traffickers stop trafficking, people stop using. Never going to happen. And so I think the idea of a war on drugs is basically, it's a recipe for a forever war of ever-increasing escalation of coercion. And it doesn't address the fundamental problem, which is how do you build a healthy individual? Why do people choose to self-medicate at such relatively high levels compared to other societies? And I think the real roots of these problems in so many cultures is rooted in issues of poverty, despair, and alienation. And the latter two, I think, cut across class lines in very interesting ways. People generally think about poverty and drugs, but in fact it crosses the class divide. And I think a meaningful, fulfilling life, I know it sounds easy or cheesy, but it's important because the best way to keep people, to prevent drug abuse and addiction is to give people a reason to look forward to tomorrow.
Well, let's talk about the United States and China and the neighborhoods that they exist in, because the United States deals with the drugs moving out through Latin America and Mexico. China also has a number of neighbors where drugs, it's ringed in a sense, isn't it? Talk to me about the similarities there.
These are essentially minimally processed agricultural commodities. It's very important to remember that. So when we're talking about things like heroin or cocaine or any of these drugs, they're very easy to produce. Cannabis is incredibly easy to grow. It's a weed. We call it a weed for a reason. These drugs cost pennies to produce per dose in terms of real-world production if they were legal. It's the black market, it's prohibition, criminalization that adds tremendous value to these substances that really ought to have no value or very little value. And so as we increase law enforcement and potential sentences people might have to serve, or executions even, they are able to then benefit from this because they can charge a higher risk premium. As long as the demand is there, these traffickers are actually benefiting from an escalation in the drug war.
And you mentioned cannabis being a weed, but there's a trend, synthetic drug use in China, rather explosive numbers, surprising in a sense. Also a problem here in the United States. How do you attack that?
These synthetic drugs are much more dangerous because they're constantly tweaking the formulas to stay one step ahead of the law in terms of precursor chemicals and analogs and that sort of thing. And so they're literally using these people as guinea pigs. So if you use synthetic drugs, you don't know what you're taking. They could have, changed the recipe, the formula, minutely every few years or months to stay ahead of the laws. So it's a cat and mouse game that increases risk and danger.
Is there something China can learn from the United States with this long-heralded war on drugs? Is there a way the U.S. and China can work together on this issue? Talk to me about that kind of relationship.
I think the demand side, I think our current drug czar has done some really good things in terms of treatment, overdose prevention, treating people with substance use disorders as human beings with medical problems, rather than as fodder for the criminal justice system. If you believe that drug abuse and addiction is a public health problem, then what sense does it make to use coercion as the primary means of making people better? To me, it's a bit like curing clinical depression with a baseball bat. Smile or I'll beat you again. You can't coerce your people into being healthy. You have to look at why they're doing these things and find ways that actually help them rather than punish them.